Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always are my fabulous co-hosts.
2022, and I get to, for this year, do second. Jackie. Shocker. It's not Diana, it's Jackie.
And it's me, Diana.
So you just did the same thing, you just did it in a different order?
Yeah.
Well,
that's the thing now?
Yeah.
Yes, that's what we've been waiting for, the build-up. It's been so long.
Okay,
I've been
For 5 years, I have gone second. And now Jackie's going to go second, and I'm going to go third, which actually means that Jackie is now married to you. So
I don't think that's how podcasts work. I don't think that's how marriage laws work at all.
It's like Wife Swap, the show.
No, but that's not what we're not a podcast about wife swapping. We're a podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research, where every week we choose a topic and we learn a lot about it and we read some research related to it. And sometimes we're even lucky enough to have a guest who wrote some of that research, who can tell us all about the research and save us a lot of trouble. We can just sit and listen and enjoy. And that's what I think all of you are going to do out there, because we are joined by Dr. Nasiah Cirincione-Ulezi. Did I say it right? Did I get it?
Yes. You got it. That was so good.
Oh, you know what? We love having guests on, and I do not ever want to mess up a guest name, because they went to the trouble of writing great research and coming on the show. And so welcome Nasiah. Thank you for coming on the show to talk with us about cultural humility and barriers to leadership. Welcome.
Thank you. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. And before we started, I have a question. How do you all have so much energy? It's the end of the day. It is. But anyway, I like it. I love your energy. And again, I'm happy to be here. Very happy.
I'm drinking a lot of caffeine.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
I took a small nap in my child's bed before this, and then I'm drinking a cup of coffee.
Got it.
I got a seltzer. I don't have anything with caffeine right now.
You don't need anything, Cap. You never need anything, Rob.
Rob's pumped to be
I'm playing
here.
the part of excited podcaster every time I see the microphone, you know.
I love it.
So, Nasiah, like I said, we're going to be talking a lot about cultural humility. We're going to be talking about some barriers to leadership, specifically for Black women in the field of behavior analysis, based on a paper you wrote. But before we get into all the research, the questions, the discussion, we'd love to just hear more about you and kind of your journey to today, to the podcast.
Oh, okay. I would love to share. So thank you for asking and creating that space for me to share. I have worked in the field of behavior analysis for 30 years, about 30 years, so a long time. Now, this is the kicker. I'm recently certified. I've only been certified for I'm going into my 4th year, so let me explain that, because I had somebody ask me the other day, well, Nasiah, you've only been certified for almost 4 years. How can you have worked in the field for 30? Because in this person's mind, the only way you can work in the field is with the BCBA credential. So let's just put that myth to bed right now.
Yeah.
It's not true. I started in the field, front lines, right out of high school, working with individuals with intellectual disabilities. And at that time, there was no BCBA credential, so my training and my supervision came from a psychologist. So I kept that position through college. I went to school to be a special education teacher. And right out of my bachelor's degree, I started working with children with special needs, autism. And again, back in those days, we did not have the BCBA credential. So my training came from a psychologist and a speech and language pathologist. I did that for a number of years. And my first position from my master's degree was in the precision teaching world. I worked with the Morningside model in Chicago under Joe Lang. I did that for a number of years and finally made my way into higher ed after I completed my doctorate degree. I worked on faculty at Chicago State University for a number of years. then went back into educational administration. It was when I was an administrator, and I was actually, at that point, I was supervising BCBAs. And I remember as they were coming in, this is more in the 2000s, around the mid 2000s, what I get people saying is, well, Nasiah, you're not a BCBA, so you can't supervise me. And at this
and
point,
I don't think the people heard that, Jackie. What was that?
expletive.
Yes. So that's really what nudged me back to get the credential. I needed it in order to be valid with those that I was supervising. So, in my 40th decade, went back to school and got certified as a board certified behavior analyst. And it was interesting. I remember when the credential was first developed, I was working in the classroom and I was completing my doctorate. And my supervisor came to me and she said, Nasiah, there's this new credential. You might want to consider enrolling at Southern. I was working on my doctorate degree again. And I said, no, I'm good. I'm good.
No more.
I'm finishing up. But little did I know that the credential would evolve into what it is today. And long story short, recently certified, and I have just a wealth of information about how I've seen this field evolve and just the practices that I was trained to use. And some of the practices were amazing, specifically as it related to working with our learners with autism. But some of the practices that I was trained under in those early years did lack humility, and they had an impact. And I can speak to some of that today. And I've watched the topography of the demographics change over the years. So when I entered the field, I didn't have a whole lot of company, even within the realm of education, as it related to folks who were working with learners with autism. There weren't a lot of Black people, let alone Black women. So, that's really what drove my passion to start writing about the barriers that I experienced along the way in attaining a leadership position. Much of it was rooted in lack of representation.
What a journey. And I hear you. That's enough school,
It was enough. Now let me tell you, I thought I've stopped, but I thought I wanted to go back and get a second doctorate degree in IO psychology. And I got in, I started taking the classes, and I said, you know what? I think doctoral level education is something you can do once in a lifetime.
Yes.
I really don't think you can go and get 2 doctorates.
That's why they call it a terminal degree, because it almost kills you.
Yeah. So I tried it and I said, no, this is not for me. Let me just stop.
I always think that too. I'm like, ooh, this thing is interesting. I'm going to go all in.
No.
And then once I go a little bit in, I'm like, ooh, it's 2 in. I have to leave it.
Yeah. And I did.
Have a better chance of getting certified as like I don't know, what's something you could just get an easy certificate, like a surf instructor. I don't know, something that sounds like more fun.
Yeah.
So I have a quick question for our listeners, right? So I'm pretending
Jackie,
right now that
they can't answer you. They can't. They're going to get this like a month from now. They don't.
They have called me. It's like a talk show, and they've called me. And in your intro, you said something about the field in the beginning, right? And some of the practices that have come lacking humility. Can you kind of expand on that and like what you mean when you say humility, and just so that our listeners are up to speed?
Absolutely. So, humility in its simplest form, if I can operationally define it, is decentering the self. Moving yourself out of the way, having or showing a low estimate of your own importance. Mm-hmm. That's what being humble and having humility is. My early training from some very well-intentioned and well-meaning people didn't include a lot of humility as it related to service to children and families, which is what my early work was. I remember being in a classroom and I had a young learner with autism, and I was told by my supervisor when we were developing programming, we were doing discrete trial training. And we had the learner kind of sitting at a table, but we had our learner kind of enclosed to where he couldn't leave. And I remember he was crying and, looked at the psychologist and I said, this absolutely this can't be right. This is a young child. He's crying. This isn't fun. I wouldn't want to come to school either if I had to. And I remember she said, oh, no, don't worry about that. That's a part of the process. That is a part of the way we train in these programs. And I remember it didn't sit well with me. A more humble approach would have been for us to really find out, what is this learner upset about? What would really be reinforcing to this learner to come to this table or this area to want to work with us? But it was the opposite. And I look back on it and I'm thinking about in the moment, even though it didn't feel good, it was so normal. Mm-hmm. It was normal to have a child sit at a table and cry. And where I was in my own evolution as a professional, and it didn't sit well in my spirit, if you will, but I didn't say anything, So that's what I mean when I say the approach lacked humility, because it really should have been us in service to that learner. And we were not in service to that learner in that moment.
Well said.
Mm-hmm.
That was great. Good example.
Yeah.
So as we continue our conversation, for listeners out there, we have two articles that we'll sort of be referring to that are leading a lot of the points of the discussion. And the first is Cultural Humility in the Practice of Applied Behavior Analysis by Wright from Behavior Analysis and Practice 2019. And then Dr. Cirincione-Ulezi's article, Black Women and Barriers to Leadership in ABA, from also Behavior Analysis and Practice from 2020. I haven't gotten to say 2020 in a little while.
Yes.
Nasiah, you were saying that article, you sort of thought of it as like a passion project right before we started recording, in terms of like just something you had to get started on. You had to get that work out there.
Yeah. I can even share the evolution of that work. It started with a call for papers from our dear Jonathan Joseph Tarbox from Behavioral Analysis and Practice. I love Dr. Jonathan Joseph. I really do. He's a good guy. But he put out that call. But it's not that he put out the call. He put it out in a very unique way that called me. And I could probably dig it up. But he said, we're looking for papers, and you don't have to have a doctorate degree. You don't have to be white. You don't have to be a man. You don't have to teach at a university. And I said, oh my goodness, he's talking to me. And one of my friends who's a BCBA here in Illinois actually sent the call to me. So I reached out to him. And I said, look, at the time, my son was in his senior year. So I had a whole lot of time on my hand because he was getting ready to leave for school. So I called Dr. Jonathan Joseph, or I emailed him, and he said, you know what, just send me some ideas of what you'd like to write. And I did. And working in the field for as long as I had a ton of ideas. I think I had one idea because I did a few years working with adults with significant physical disabilities. And I wanted to discuss sexuality as it related to adults with physical disabilities. And I thought that would be really interesting. And I talked about maybe doing something with children. And I did work in early intervention. And I said, what about discussing the diagnosis of autism and how that impacts families in the early intervention system? And then I threw out the idea of, and two, I'm a Black woman and the field has changed, but I still don't see myself in large numbers in leadership positions. And that's when he said, all these topics that you've thrown out are just great, but Nasiah, that one, I just can't live without it. And those are the words he used. He said, I just can't live without it. So I said, okay, and I started writing on it. Really, what I did was get in conversation with other Black women, BCBAs, who are here in Illinois. There's a group of us who over the years we've supported each other, and they started sharing their stories with me, and I with them. And through the stories, we kind of had a common theme, it's and really the theme transcends the field of behavior analysis, but that there's some parts of our field that make it fertile ground for others, people from marginalized communities, not to be able to make it up through the rungs of leadership. And that paper, it was really a cathartic experience, because I started reflecting on, pain points in my career where I could have moved, but for whatever move, meaning been elevated to a different position, but for whatever reason, I didn't. And again, I started talking to my colleagues who were in the same position. Sometimes it was the opportunities weren't extended. Other times it was, do I really want to step into this space where I'm going to be the only one, where I know what I'm going to have to contend with? And we'll talk about some of that during the course of this conversation. So it was two-pronged. It was the environment wasn't welcoming, and also opportunities just weren't there. And at the same time, I and my colleagues would see other people elevated very quickly, seamlessly. Just, okay, they're in their frontline entry-level position, and then the next couple years, they move into management, and then they're in a senior leadership position. Why? Because typically, no one kind of makes it to leadership alone. You typically have someone who is going to groom you, kind of take you under their wings. And that wasn't happening to me and others who look like me.
Yeah.
In the workplace, for myself, especially within our field, it was often very lonely. Very lonely. And I talk about loneliness as being a barrier.
I love the distinction between mentorship and sponsorship that you made in there. And I hadn't thought about that before. And the value of sponsorship, meaning someone who's in a position of power is putting you forward as like the next person to get nominated for something, right? And it's all about those connections that you have. And without that from someone who's your superior, you're unlikely to have those opportunities to move up the ladder. I hadn't thought about that distinction.
Yeah. I want to talk about that a little bit, because it is a difference. We often use mentorship and sponsorship interchangeably, but there's a difference. And mentorship and sponsorship are very important as one is moving through their career and trying to elevate towards positions. I have had some mentors throughout the course of my career, but what I haven't had is a sponsor. And the distinction and the discrimination I make in the article is, A mentor is there and they guide, and we have many mentors. Our mentors can be peers, they can be superior, supervisors, but a sponsor is a little different. A sponsor is that person who is going to advocate for you when you're not in the room.
Right.
A sponsor is that person who's going to take you under their wings and really, provide opportunities that you probably wouldn't get otherwise. And the thing with sponsorship, because in essence, a sponsor kind of gives you their professional resources and networks. So you have to be ready for a sponsor. It comes, you don't get sponsorship early in your career. Sponsorship typically comes mid-career. It's when you're at a point where you've been sufficiently, mentored that you have something to give to someone else professionally. And it's there in that space that I saw many of my Black colleagues, specifically women, we could maybe get sponsors, but we could maybe get mentors, but that sponsorship, somebody to really advocate for us when we're not in the room, to share networks. Now, I've certainly gotten that in the past year and a half, but I didn't have it earlier. And it's something now as I mentor our early career practitioners, I talk to them about getting ready for someone to come and kind of share their networks with them so that they can kind of move to the next level in their career. And, I get some pushback from this. People say, well, if we engage that way around careers, that's kind of how we keep some of these barriers in place when we think in terms of networks. But I think professionally, if we look across different professions, I think that most professions have a way to elevate from early career to more senior level positions. And it is through the sharing of networks and resources. It's kind of how, again, what I talked about earlier, this whole process is kind of how we evolve culture, transmit the culture of our field.
Nasiah, I'd love to just, again, and I put this question not because you didn't explain it in the article, but because I think it is always good to bring up the idea of when we're talking about, as a field, hiring individuals from underrepresented groups, specifically Black women, as you talked about in your article. Would you mind just sort of summarizing some of the big losses that can occur when you are sort of forgetting to hire outside of sort of your own kind of identity group? So, for my example, like, I'll hire all my buddies from college who are probably all, or mostly like white men, because I think that can get lost in the idea of, and you'll hear feedback from folks sometimes like, I don't want to just arbitrarily hire people just because they're not me. But it's not that simple. There's much more to be lost, I think, by not hiring, diversely.
Absolutely. And thank you for that question. There is such richness and variability, and our science teaches us that sameness has limitations. And there's so much to be learned from variety. I think one of the ways that sameness impacts, I'll speak specifically to our field, one of the ways that sameness impacts us in behavior analysis is we don't get the perspectives of others, which means that our treatment, the way we are working with those we serve, is coming from one lens. When we, and my hope is as a field, we get to the point that when we see environments that lack variability, that the first thought that comes into our mind is, oh no, we're missing something here. We're lacking something here. Oftentimes, because I get a lot of people, organizations that reach out to me and they want me to come and assist with equity, diversity, and inclusion, thinking, from the lens of, we want people to come and, Nasiah, our doors are open but they're not coming. And I think about that. That approach is really looking from the lens of, okay, if those people, the other people come here, that's going to do something for them. It's not looking from the lens of if we start working, that is going to change our environment, change our perspective, and really do something and give us something as an organization, as a group, if we have variability. One of the great things about being 50 years old is I have a lot of lived experience and I see the value in the variability. I see the value in looking at things from different perspectives. And I've seen over the years organizations who have a variety of people, a variety of ways of being, a variety of different thoughts and perspectives. I see the creativity that brings to treatment. In that creativity, serves the people who consume our science very well, and it serves us well.
Now, I know one of the themes that came up in the interviews that you did, which I think is certainly important to bring up, were the ideas that a lot of the challenges and barriers that the Black women you interviewed had in terms of getting leadership position, I think were ones that, without taking into account cultural humility, without doing things like having, in-depth conversations about learning histories, would really be easily passed up. Like you mentioned, companies saying, "Oh, we love diversity, but no one will. Whoa, we can't get anyone hired." Like a big shrug, not really thinking about. It's not as simple as, "Oh, well, we'll just hire more people from this group or this ethnicity or this, male, female, or gender, whatever they like." It wasn't that simple. And I know when you mentioned things like the idea of supervision, and this one struck me, and I'm hoping you can give me some direct tips as well on this part. But, as a supervisor saying, "Oh, well, if you feel like you're getting passed up for leadership, well, you should stand up and tell that, give the feedback that you and how, hey, I'm a white guy. It's super easy for me to jump into a room and say, everybody listen up. Here's my feedback and expect that to be received positively. But that is potentially really just well-meaning but harmful advice to give to a supervisee because of a learning history.
Oblivious, I feel like
oblivious is the better word. Yeah. That sounds like me. Oblivious. Yeah. But could you report it to some of those themes and some of those statements from your interviewees and from your own experiences?
Absolutely. What you're speaking to, and I think as I'm getting ready to expand on this paper, is really power and privilege. And really being present to that, all of us being present to what our power and privileges are in the workplace. I could talk about this for hours and hours, but as a woman of color and a Black woman, I have not always enjoyed the freedom to speak freely, specifically in the workplace. Now, I mentioned this in the paper, and I want to talk about it here, is this idea, because it's just so salient to me, this idea of, in the workplace, the Black woman being angry. And that is a stereotype I think many of us Black women can relate to. That particular stereotype over the course of my career has probably shaped my behavior more than anything else. When people listen to me speak, in this cadence in my voice that people just love so much, was shaped because I had to monitor my tone and I had to monitor what I was saying, because I didn't want to come off as angry. And some of the words I would hear over the years were, you're angry, you're not a team player, you're combative. Truly, I'll share this with you. This is something that this happened recently. I had a colleague who got an email from a supervisor, Black colleague, Black woman, who had all those things identified, tagged her as all of those things. She was devastated. And the email came after she stood up for herself and advocated for herself. So it's interesting, whereas my white male colleagues might be able to walk into the supervisor's office and say, no, I'm not going to do this, or, I think I want to do it differently. I certainly have had the option to do that, but it would come with a different consequence. And those consequences shape my behaviors. And again, going back to kind of what your initial question was, me as a Black woman, I haven't always enjoyed the same freedom to be able to speak as my white, or even others of color, but not Black peers have had in the workplace. Mm-hmm. Speaking freely is something that we don't have equal access to. And it's something we should be present to as we, our supervisors, be present to those different power dynamics and power differentials. So if you have a supervisee, who does come from a marginalized identity community, you might not consider, or you might need to consider, does this person have the freedom to speak freely? What consequences or contingencies will they be met with if they speak? And for me, what kept me quiet for a long time is I didn't want to lose my job.
Mm-hmm. This actually happened to me as I supervise many people, right, over the years. And I have had the privilege of supervising many people of color. And one supervisee at one point said to me of another supervisor, I'm not getting what I need and what I deserve. And I was like, why don't you just go tell them? Tell them, go, because that's what, has been my experience. And they looked at me and they're like, I can't do that. Yeah. And I was like, why not? And they're like, this, and this. Exactly. I'm like, yeah, taking a step back, noted. Let's try something else. Because because it wasn't my experience and I hadn't had that sort of conversation, right? As a supervisor, I gave them the wrong information, right? I wasn't humility. I didn't demonstrate humility in my supervision practice at that point. And so that's something that I'm always mindful of now because it hit me like smack in the face that I was like, wow. I gave you horrible advice. I'm very sorry.
I'm so glad that you had that experience, and it can change your supervision, or at least open you up to a different way of supervising. Can I say this too? Because I don't know totally how you all identify, but I think I'm looking at 3 white people, right? Mm-hmm. 3 folks who identify as okay. Jackie, thank you.
It's not just the terrible lighting in our recording room. This is very white.
Nope. Very white.
One of the things that I have become very present to, and this has been in the past couple years, since the world has kind of been disrupted around race, and we're really talking more and looking at this more, is that one of the things that those of us with power in the workplace can do is really share our privilege with those who are more vulnerable. One thing that came up about a year ago, now I have worked at an agency for about 10 years with the same folks on my team. At one point, I was the only Black woman BCBA on my team. That's changed. But I remember when George Floyd was murdered, we had a moment, and at least 3 of my colleagues said during a meeting, Nasiah, yes, I've seen you here all these years. I've seen you be disrespected. I've seen you talked over in meetings. Now, I felt some type of way about that because I said, you've seen it and you've said nothing. You've seen it and you've said nothing. So this is what I say. This is what I've learned. That silence, it locks all of these variables that maintain these barriers. It keeps them in place. If you are in a workplace and you see someone from a marginalized community being disrespected, not treated fairly, use your privilege and say something. Speak. That is powerful. And I say all of us, because one thing that I'm present to, again, at 50 years old, one thing that I know is I am in that spot now as a Black woman where I do have power and privilege in the workplace. I am not vulnerable. My child is an adult. I was singing a real different tune when I had a minor child at home. I wasn't as quick to speak up. So what I do, when I'm in the workplace and I see things that are not right, and I know that people are vulnerable, it's a lot of things we have choice in, but a lot of us don't have a choice. We have to go to work. And it's not as easy as I'm just going to quit my job. So I have started recognizing that where I do have power and privilege and using it. So where a person who's more vulnerable may not be able to speak, I can. And I will take that.
I did call the supervisor. That was I was like, you're not going to call the supervisor. I'm going to call the supervisor.
Yes, that's what we do. That's what we do. And that's what changes it when we're all aware of in the workplace where our power and privilege is, that everybody doesn't have it, and we use it to help and lift each other.
Sorry to interrupt, but before we continue on with our conversation with Dr. Cirincione-Ulezi, I do have to remind all of our listeners one thing. ABA Inside Track is ACE approved. By listening to this episode, you're able to earn 1 learning credit. All you need to do is finish listening to the episode, then go to the website, abainsidetrack.com/getceus, GET-CEUS. You need to enter in some information, though, including 2 code words we've hidden in the episode. I'm going to tell you the first one right now. It's belly dance, BELLYDANCE. One word or spaced out, however you want to write it. I bet you won't know. These are special guest code words, but I don't know if you'll be able to guess which of us, of the 4 folks on the show, have done belly dancing in the past. I think I know. Please write in with your guesses, but you definitely need to remember the code word, belly dance.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
All right, now let's continue with our conversation about cultural humility. Nasiah, you've already given, both in the paper and then also tonight, some just really actionable steps for individuals with power who would like to be someone who is dismantling these barriers. Are there any other themes that you came out in the interviews that we haven't discussed yet, or any other sort of ideas that either you want to go talk in more depth on than you could in the paper in terms of how individuals with power or individuals supervising those who have been kind of historically marginalized, things that they can do, actively or should be doing as part of their own practice of cultural humility. Anything that we haven't gone over yet? I mean, I'm sure there's a ton we haven't gone over yet.
There is. And if you will, absolutely. And if you'll allow me to jump around a bit, let me back up because, again, I've been taking data throughout the last year, So this particular article was written at a point in time in my own evolution and growth as a woman, a Black woman and a professional, and I've continued to grow. There's a piece of information that I didn't have when I wrote it a couple years ago, and that is, addressing my own values. I think up until a couple years ago, I kind of knew what was important to me, but I hadn't done a really deep dive to really identify, Nasiah, what is it that matters to you in this life? So a couple years ago, and this was after the article went into print, I did that and it changed my life. It really did. I started to really look at and I listed my 5 top values, and they really revolved around, being seen, being heard, equity. And then I started looking at, and I did a lot of this work through ACT and the ACT matrix. It truly has changed my life. I got present to when I was being pulled away from my values and what pulled me towards my values. Now, what I found was, and I didn't even realize I was doing it until I did that value sort and I identified my values. I realized that equity is incredibly important to me, but I realized in the workplace, I was shutting down. I was keeping quiet because I was scared. And I had lived in that space for years and I didn't know why I was so uncomfortable. But I realized, like moment to moment, I was being pulled away from my values. So I made a conscious decision a couple years ago. And again, it's a decision I could make because I am less vulnerable. I'm at a point where I'm kind of financially okay. I don't have any minor children. I'm fine. But I said to myself, I will never be in a work environment again where I am being pulled away from what is important to me. And I stay in that space, not saying I don't get pulled, but now because I know what's important to me, I've identified my values, I can quickly recenter. I can feel it. I can feel when I'm being pulled away. And then I'm gonna share this too. When I get pulled away, I start engaging in that reflection that I talked about in the paper. And I go right back. And that practice, knowing my values and the reflection, which I'd like to talk about too, has fundamentally changed my life. And it has certainly changed my experiences as a professional.
I think this would be a great time. Let's continue talking about that idea of reflection. I mean, I think if we could take a quick tangent stop, I want to go back because I'm guessing that there are some folks out there who this is all hopefully not new, but is newer. And I know we've talked about humility. We talked about cultural humility, but I don't think we ever spent a second talking about the difference between what I think everyone has been working on, which is the idea of cultural competence versus cultural humility. And when we're talking about reflection and growth, I think the distinction between the two terms, this might be a good time to make sure if you're listening and you're not quite sure if they're different or did we misspeak or alphabetically this one comes next, where this term came from and kind of the big difference. I'd love it if we could talk a little bit about why are we talking about humility, cultural humility, rather than just cultural competence, which was
Absolutely.
Until recently, that was the term, right? That was what so many of us were like.
Old news, man.
I know. I feel I'm so far behind already. You know, I thought I mastered that cultural competence thing. I read like 2 articles and everything, right?
You know what? Thank you. You guys are great at just keeping me on track, because I would just keep going and going. Thank you. Yes, cultural competence and cultural humility. Let's talk about that difference. Now, competence. There's value in being competent. There's value in being culturally competent. But competent kind of denotes a discrete beginning and an end. It's I got it. Okay, I know this now. That's right. Competence. Humility, the difference is humility is ongoing. It requires ongoing learning, ongoing reflection about culture. You never get to an end point. Now, this is what I'll say. There are those in that camp who say, we're just going to throw out cultural competence. I'm not one of those people. I believe there is value in understanding what you can about another's culture. There's value in seeking to understand. So I don't say cultural competence is wrong. What I say is incomplete. Mm-hmm. And humility completes it. So let me give you an example. I'm a Black woman, but if you look at me like, okay, I know Nasiah, I got it. I know Black culture. You're just going to miss. I'm just going to tell you right now, if you use me as a guidepost, you're going to miss. I'm one Black woman.
Right. Yeah.
And so you can't be competent in truly competent. You can seek it, but you can't be competent in one's culture because it keeps going. You know, if you're competent in Black culture, then you have to know Black culture, East Coast, West Coast, Black culture, North, South.
Yeah.
You know, and then North, South, you know, my family is from Alabama and Mississippi, 2 different Black cultures. You know, there's some intersection and overlap. So again, when we approach culture with humility, we're approaching it with curiosity, the readiness and willingness to learn, the readiness and willingness to listen. Whereas competence, once you think you've got something, you kind of shut the door on that ongoing learning. So that is the difference. Is truly, I do not want to throw out competence, because I'm one who is always seeking to learn more about another's culture, but it's incomplete. And I continue to work in service of humility. And there's another term, being responsive to the cultural needs of others.
I loved the definition that you gave us earlier of cultural humility as decentering yourself.
Yeah.
And I feel like with cultural competence, you yourself sort of still stay at the core of that, because, you know, we're behavior analysts. We want to set that mastery criteria. Right?
Yes, we do.
Like I want to be 90% competent in whatever culture.
I was hoping for 80% myself. I was hoping that was good enough.
Right. But you're still focusing on you and how much you expect to be able to learn. But one cannot ever fully understand another's culture because you haven't lived that experience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then you touched on something else, that reflective piece. Mm-hmm. So if I may segue into reflection.
Please do. Yes.
Okay, let's segue into reflection.
I'm taking notes.
Okay. Okay. The first step towards practicing cultural humility is self-reflection. Yes. Looking at the self, which in our field, we are not trying to do. We are trying to really look at other. We are not trained to look back in on ourselves. And when I talk about reflection, this will make you chuckle. I was talking to a colleague who's well established in our field, who's well published, someone who's highly respected. And I talked about reflection, and they said, well, Nasiah, we do reflect. We reflect on our data. We reflect on our plans. That was what this individual said. This is a brilliant person who said this. So, but that's not what I'm speaking to. I'm speaking the reflection back in on our own covert and overt behaviors and really questioning them is what we're not taught to do. In fact, when I start engaging behavior analysts in reflection, it feels a little funny. You're like, oh, okay. Oh, yeah, my thoughts. Yeah. But it is the first step. And I will tell you, I wrote it in that paper because that's the way I was trained when I got my special ed training. I was trained to use reflection, and I put it in that paper. I'm a faculty director at Capella University, and we are now infusing reflection in our coursework as a part of, you are too, awesome, as a part of training for practitioners. And it's been powerful. Just imagine if we have a field of practitioners who are engaging in reflection, not just reflective thinking, but that reflective practice routinely. And that is the difference. You know, many of us are reflective thinkers, but when we engage in it as a practice, meaning we set aside time consistently and routinely, it's a practice. It will fundamentally change our field. You know, I had the opportunity to meet with or speak with Dr. Alan Nuringer. He is our colleague, our great colleague from Reed University, who wrote that first article. He wrote it 30 years ago, Humble Behaviorism. And I shared with him my passion for reflection. And his words to me were, you know, there's power in reflection, and the power is in that pause. It's in the pause. The pause is after the stimulus and before the response, there's a pause. And in that pause, he said, that's where our bias, our unconscious bias tends to live. So if we can stop in that pause, that's where we have an opportunity to make a more informed decision, a response that's not rooted in habit. So it's this idea of reflection, which I feel I'm playing my part in evolving the culture of our field by really pushing it into our training programs, at least at Capella, and at least those who come into contact with me through my training and speaking, they'll hear it. And I'm hoping I'm nudging some interest for others to start embracing reflection. Just imagine if we all did it routinely and consistently, how it would fundamentally change our field.
Now, Nasiah, this may be too specific a question or missing the point more in that level of specificity. But I know in your article and then in the Wright article, there are some, kind of leading questions that we can think of when we're talking about self-reflection. And now, since it's a part of your curriculum, you're probably thinking, well, where do we start? Like I know in Wright, there's the whole table of essential questions for critical self-reflection. And for someone who's a novice reading all of these questions, that's a lot of questions. I haven't even asked myself, how do I self-reflect to begin with? Is there sort of a question that you would recommend if you have to pick one today? Because maybe all of them might be too many. Tomorrow you can do 5 and then you can, jump up. But like a self-reflection question that you found, I've recommended this to students and they've been able to just grow a lot faster rather than get caught up in the details of self-reflection, perhaps, or am I missing the point in terms of self-reflection? It's not like the one question.
You're not. It's not. It's many questions, and it's many questions over time, and the questions change and evolve. And the more questions you ask, the more that will come. This is what I'll tell you to do. Ask yourself what's important to you, and then ask yourself, why is that important? What's important? Start there. What's important to you and why? And see what comes up. And as you start engaging with that very reflective question, there are going to be more questions that come up. Self-inquiry is powerful. If we turn our analytic skills back on ourselves, there's no telling what might not come up. I think we just haven't been trained to do it. But once we start, and once you start engaging with that question alone, it can crack the door open for some powerful discovery.
And crying, right?
Am I required to cry? That's a lot.
I mean,
break down those barriers, Rob.
Yeah, talk about learning history. I'm a guy. We can't cry. Don't know if that's not good advice.
That's a crying question right there. If you haven't asked yourself that, and then you ask yourself, and then you answer that, you are gonna cry, audience. And just be prepared and be cool with it. Bring some tissues.
You know what? Okay, now just segue into this. Now, I can't speak on ACT yet with authority. I want you to invite me back next year for an ACT conversation.
100%.
Yes, because I'm getting there. I'm getting more fluent. But what you're speaking to, just being with all of the emotions we don't like, that's another powerful tool that I'm learning. Because everything, not just within our field, but everything within our culture pulls us away from and tells us that, sad is wrong, angry is wrong. No, let's be with it. Let's start looking at it and questioning it. It's power in that. And really diving into ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, is teaching me that. There's so many things, especially in the realm of, equity and inclusion, these fusions that we have, when I think about racism and discrimination and even the word bias, those words can evoke shame and guilt in some individuals because that's the meaning that we've made of them. Imagine if we could hear those words and not attach all that negative meaning to it. Wouldn't that free us up to have some pretty powerful conversations?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I forced some family members because I was doing some of the preparation on these articles around Thanksgiving. I forced some of them to engage with me. My family really enjoys my presence these days. And just having that conversation about how, based on my own learning history and my own power, my own privilege, this is something that has gotten easier as we've had more episodes where we've talked about power privilege. We've talked about bias. We've talked about race. We've talked about racism. We've talked about barriers, and just how it has been something that doing it was so terrifying at first because I don't want to say the wrong thing, or I don't want to look like I don't care when really I don't have all the information. I don't have the learning history. So of course there's no way I'm going to not look kind of stupid doing it, but having so many, I think, increasing leaders in the field of color who want to have these conversations. It's been very inviting. And I know for me, just getting to do it and have the conversations and get a chance to self-reflect, I always so appreciate that chance because it is something that I would like, I'm sure everyone would like to say, let's have the honest conversation. Let's talk about experiences and not be scared. Like, what if I say the wrong thing? Or what if because you're going to probably do that if you're someone coming with power and privilege. And you're going to have to sit with that. You're going to have to sit with the fact that you might have said something.
And it's not the responsibility of the other person to make you feel better.
No.
Right, exactly. And so getting used to that and owning it and coming to it with that spirit of humility. And you're not the center of that conversation either, right? It's for the benefit of the cause.
Thank you for bringing that up. It brings something else to mind for me, we're within a culture now of, there are people who are afraid to speak for fear of saying the wrong thing. And there's the idea of microaggressions, which unfortunately, now I'm going to say something controversial. and if I can be controversial on your podcast, I'm going to say, okay, this idea of microaggressions is the way it's been defined, the narrative around it has been flawed. You know, this is what I'll say about it. And I'm working on this within my own community. We are all going to say things wrong. Every last one of us. We are all going to engage in this idea of microaggression. We will, because I have been so-called microaggressed from folks who look just like me. It is going to happen. Why? Not because we're bad, but because we're human. Right. We're human and we're not going to get it right. So my messaging around this is, let's put more work into being humble. Mm-hmm. And if we offend, being able to accept the feedback. Right. Accept the feedback. But this idea of, and I've gotten caught up in it too, I just don't want to offend anybody. So I won't say anything. It doesn't serve us well. Mm-hmm. So what I want to do is say, look, we will all engage, all of us will engage in microaggressions. We will. The narrative around it, a lot of it, and I think I even had it in my article. When I do the next one, I'm going to change it because I'm a scientist and I can admit that my information has evolved. But all of us will engage in microaggressions. We will impact others. We will say the wrong thing unintentionally. So where my effort is going now is being humble. And when someone has to correct me, what I am committed to doing is not being defensive. Yeah. And accepting the feedback. And this has become salient to me because even within my own community, I'm part of a marginalized group within our field. I'm 50 years old. I am an within the community. I am. You know, you'll get there too.
We're right behind you.
Yeah, we're closer than
we're in the 40s. So we're right there. We're right there.
And it's interesting. I mean, that people will say things to me and not think twice about it. Because the narrative around this microaggressions is something that white folks do to people of color. No, it's something that human beings do to human beings. We do that. It's because we are naturally not humble. Human beings are not. That is not our natural state of being. Hmm. It's something that we have to work on and build capacity for and learn. So this may be controversial. Folks listening may, have some words to say about it, but I feel the same way about bias. The messaging around bias should be that it's the way we as human beings organize information. Let's not make it good, bad, right, or wrong. Let's reflect on what our biases are and look at where our biases may adversely impact humans in our environment, but let's not make it wrong. And let's kind of diffuse and pull apart the shame and the guilt we have over our bias.
And one thing that I took from the article and maybe from what you're saying here too, is that when you talked about microaggressions and we talked about bias, it's really about learning too, right? So if microaggressions are unintentional, right? Like we hope in our hearts that they usually are, right? That it's due to a faulty learning history because of that lack of cultural humility or that lack of cultural responsiveness. So I think taking it as, I know a lot of people say, oh, if you engage in microaggressions, you're a bad person, you don't care about people. but really it's a lack of a repertoire, right? So, and all of us, everyone included, right, needs to just be continually engaging in opportunities to expand our repertoire so that we may recognize those situations in which microaggressions or bias may occur, and then, don't do it.
Right, learn from it. Yeah.
Learn, reflect, learn,
Right.
because ultimately that's what our reflection is for, is to enhance our practice, and big part of that is, I know we coach and we teach a lot on giving feedback, but there's value in being able to receive feedback. I mean, I think there's something just within our culture to where people correct us or give us feedback. It's kind of like, oh, it doesn't feel so nice. But if we can develop that, I think that's another way that we can evolve our field towards more humility.
Mm-hmm.
2 whole classes on receiving feedback.
Can you imagine?
We could keep going. I could do a whole class on receiving feedback, like a whole semester.
Yes. Oh, I thought you meant you had 2 classes. One was like receiving and the second was feedback. Like, you got to put them together. It's a whole year of just...
that could be it too, right?
You could role play.
Complex.
So, Nasiah, looking into the future of... I don't want to say this works out. I don't know. That's not quite the term, but a lot of, looking at breaking down barriers to leadership for marginalized groups and specifically Black women. When you were preparing your article, the demographic information on who has a BCBA was not, that was nowhere to be seen. I don't even know if the change had come over that demographic information was even going to be collected when you would have been writing your paper. Right. I would think it probably wouldn't have.
I looked.
Was it? I don't even think it was. This is something we're gonna do at that point.
Yes. See, and that's where the representation comes in, because the people who were making the decisions, it didn't matter. That's what it was. So I think now people are more present to, and you get to it, Jackie, is representation does matter because we bring our learning histories to our work. That's what we bring our learning histories to our work, where we set priorities for what's important. And within the field, there were people, who were surrounded by sameness. It didn't occur to them that, wow, we should probably have our eye on who else is in the field? What other people but it wasn't important. I think now it is, and we can start really looking at this data to see where we might make even more changes. I'm very interested in the testing data. Who's passing the test? I know within my own community, a lot of people had trouble passing the test, not because they're not brilliant people, just because of life barriers. It's I think the way our field is kind of structured, that test is rigorous, and I'm not saying it shouldn't be. I'm grateful that it's rigorous, but that rigor does have an impact on someone who is maybe an older student who's married and has 3 kids. I mean, my experience is that test, you can't pass it on the fly. You have to be in a situation where you have a lot of time to study, so the information becomes salient. I think that's real easy when you're 22 and you're in a dorm room, but when you throw in some life, which many of our, not just our students of color, but many of our students of color come with different life circumstances. And I think we can start looking at the data to see how we might build bridges to some of these barriers to getting certified.
Right. And providing more support where you might not necessarily, right, because of life circumstances.
Yes.
Giving more flexibility.
Yes.
Where instead of being like, this is not how we've done it before.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
I think that might help. We've had a lot of those conversations over the past couple of years about what we've allowed, right, in our program, and what we might not have allowed in the past, just due to like, well, you're a graduate program, right? But Diana had 2 kids in a graduate, like in her PhD, right? There was some flexibility there. Kind of.
What I want you to do, I mean, flexibility, it's compassion. It is definitely compassion, which we are. I'm so proud of our Capella team. You know, I work with Julianne Leslie and Dana Reinecke, and we are
Julianne.
Do you know Julianne? Oh, she's just a treasure.
Oh no, I thought it was a boy. I don't know her. There is a Julian.
No,
there's a
Julian Leslie.
Julian Leslie. Yeah.
Yeah,
like,
she's.
She works at Capella. Oh, I don't know her, but I want to.
She is amazing. She is amazing, and I'm so proud of our work at Capella and what we're doing to just really evolve the field and support our learners and give them a repertoire of skills that will have people want to engage with our beautiful and powerful science.
That's awesome.
So proud. Yes. Julianne and Dana, can you bring us back? And so the 3 of us can come and tell you about our program at Capella. We would love to do that.
Yeah.
Sure. Oh, yeah. Okay. So, Nasiah, we're getting to the point where you've been so gracious with your time, but in terms of starting to kind of wrap up with some last summary points in the little section we like to call Dissemination Station, unless it changed.
Yeah.
No, that didn't change. Thank goodness. I was worried you guys changed your introductions. I thought maybe
just the introduction. I was feeling.
Was I supposed to do the train sound?
Never.
I don't know. Do you want to do a train?
Oh,
you can
Jackie's
do it if
not
you want.
giving. No, she's not.
No,
giving
Jackie's
I'm not giving it up. Sorry, that's like the thing I do. I'm not giving that up. I just didn't want to be third for 5 years in a row.
No, next 5 you get to be second.
I mean, you guys can jump in. Everyone
year.
makes fun of my introduction. I'm sure anyone could do it now. It's
Hey,
exactly the same. It's
back.
exactly the same every time.
So we're here.
We're here. We're the dissemination
now we do the wrap
station.
Up.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, Nasiah, you talked a little bit about some ways that demographic information could be used more effectively now that it's being collected to look at patterns. You also mentioned some kind of research ideas at kind of near the end of the article, sort of pulling from some of the OBM literature to sort of look more systematically at barriers. Is that something that the demographic information is going to help with, or is that more just general principles that could come into, if you're running an organization, AB organization, here are some principles you should really be looking at in some of your design or in sort of your own internal research, maybe even what are some of your thoughts of where is there to go with that? Where should people be starting?
Okay, this is what I'll say. I definitely think that demographic data can be used and it can be powerful and it can really inform how we're going to move forward with addressing systemic barriers to different people moving into the field and definitely people moving towards leadership. People of color, specifically, in my case, women of color, Black women in the field. I remember researching for the article and I started reaching out and I looked through the OBM literature. A lot of it has to do with physical safety. What I'm suggesting is, and perhaps it'll be me, is really engaging our OBM expertise to look at psychological factors in the workplace that may serve as barriers to different people feeling safe within our field and within the workplace in behavior analysis. And thinking about moving forward, I am very passionate about our verified course sequence and really us not creating a course, but looking at all of our courses, all of our wonderfully, beautifully designed courses, and really infusing some principles of values identification and reflection. So this is something that becomes just normalized within our field. That the idea of, equity and diversity is not something that we kind of check the box on because we've taken a class, but it's infused It's infused throughout all of our training. So our practitioners end up in the field and end up in front of consumers, just understanding, again, the power of our science and how they can be in service to consumers in a way that is affirming and safe and powerful.
Very well said. I think that is a good. There's certainly a lot to do there, but that's why it's all things for the future. We got not. I don't want to say plenty of time, but because it's something that is going to be happening. And
I just feel like this is a really exciting time for our field, and that I'm hopeful that what seems to be happening now is really a sea change with respect to how we think about what we expect for BCBAs, and it's a much broader scope of expectation than is just represented in the task list. And I hear it in what you're saying, Nasiah, and is what Jackie and I are doing too, is, they say that if you can't do, teach, right? But I don't think that way.
Yes.
Because you talked earlier about the culture of our field. We as, the teachers for the next generation of BCBAs have a huge honor and responsibility of producing that cultural shift in how they think about what we're doing. And I've loved this conversation on cultural humility because we so often, and in our past episodes, if you go back to that Hughes Fong article from 2016, they break it down as first you got to take care of yourself, and then you can address how you're going to best serve others through cultural humility. And a lot of the material I think that exists out there is on cultural humility toward others. But first you have to do that work for yourself. Right. And this conversation has centered a lot around that. And if we can better prepare our students and our trainees to have that type of self-reflection, that's going to make them better BCBAs and better supervisors down the road so that we can continue to spread this out. And that's what's going to produce a cultural shift.
I agree. Well said. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm very bad at asking questions. It turns out I always think I'm going to ask a question, and then it just ends with a period.
It's better than my questions, which are like I feel like there's a Simpsons episode where there's some good, someone's just giving an anecdote for 20 minutes. They go, "What's your question?" "I want to ask you about the budget." It's like, that's not what they're talking. I think that's every question I ask. Oh, well, I'll self-reflect on that, right? That's what we talked about.
Yes, we did.
Dr. Cirincione-Ulezi, thank you so much for coming on the show tonight. We
Thank you
so
for having
appreciate
me.
it. If there are individuals out there listening and they say, "All right, Nasiah, she's got all the self-reflection answers, I think I got to send her an email. I got to get in touch with her." Or if they would be interested in sort of sharing some of their own barriers, possibly maybe a follow-up article. Is there a place that people can reach out to you?
Yes. Nasiah, Nasiah 999 at msn.com. I am very accessible. Email me. I email back. I do Zoom calls. I'm accessible. I like to hear from people.
It's very nice of you to give your time.
Thanks so much once again to Dr. Nasiah Cirincione-Ulezi for coming on the show, for talking to us about her work, and for giving us even more thoughts about future directions, as well as some, let's be honest, direct advice of ways that we can improve our own practices. We hope you all feel the same way after listening to that episode. Before we wrap up for the night, I want to make sure everyone gets the last secret code word. It is candle, CANDLE. We were talking about some favorite candle scents before recording. Certainly the smell of kind of trees and fir was one. We have some new peppermint smells in our house due to the holiday season. I hope you all have a great candle to smell. Not while it's lit necessarily. I mean, unless it's from far away, right? Don't stick your face in a candle, folks. It's a safety tip from Rob. Candle. And with that, we come to the end of another episode of ABA Inside Track. We sure do hope you enjoyed the show. We would love it if you left a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you can leave reviews. Hey, why not subscribe to the show so you get a new episode every single week? There are some other ways you can reach out to us. Certainly all social media, we're on as ABA Inside Track. These episodes get posted on the YouTube page for ABA Inside Track, where you can see them with the YouTube subtitling feature. You can find our website, abainsidetrack.com, where you can get links to the articles discussed in this episode, purchase CEs, as well as see our whole back catalog of previous episode topics. And if you want even more ABA Inside Track action, why not join us over at patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where for just $3 a month, you can get all of these episodes ahead of time. If you'd be interested in even more content, for $5 a month, you can gain access to our special live events. We just did our first one in December. We'll be doing another one in a few months, as well as some Q&As and discounts to the CE store. If you want even more content, including 2 free CEs, you can join at our $10 level, where we do a seasonal book club where we talk about a book related to the field of behavior analysis for over 2 hours. That is only available for our special patrons. Our most recent book club was for the behavioral economics book Nudge. We should have another vote for patrons coming out soon for our next book club choice that'll be coming out in the spring. And remember, that's patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. You can also email us at any time at abainsidetrack@gmail.com with feedback or ideas for episodes. Big thanks to all of you listeners. Big thanks to Jackie and Diana. Big thanks to our guest, Dr. Nasiah Cirincione-Ulezi. And of course, we couldn't make the show without the help of Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro music, Kyle Sturry for making our interstitial music, and Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his editing work. Thank you all, and thank you again. We'll be back next week with another full-length episode. But until then, keep responding. Bye.